When Italy rolled into Africa thinking they could carve out an empire, they picked the wrong country to play games with. In 1896, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia led a massive disciplined army against the invading Italians at the Battle of Adwa. The result wasn't just resistance, it was a rout. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were killed or captured, and the myth of European invincibility was shattered. For decades afterwards, Ethiopia stood as a beacon across the continent, living proof that Africa could fight back and win. While Mussolini's fascist forces occupied the country in 1936, inflicting brutal violence and deploying poison gas, their presence was short-lived, and the country was liberated just 5 years later. Given that Italian settlement was minimal, it's debatable whether this occupation truly meant that Ethiopia was considered colonized. The victory at Adwa in 1896, though, remains one of the most significant moments in African history, when an African kingdom not only resisted the imperial scramble for Africa, but decisively humiliated a European power. Even though Italy was kind of mid to begin with. But anyway, moving on. Liberia's story is unlike any other in Africa. The country was founded in the 1820s by freed African Americans with the backing of the American Colonization Society, and it was meant as a homeland for people formerly enslaved in the United States. Think of it kind of like Israel, but with African American settlers instead of Jews. Kind of, though it's a slippery slope. In 1847, Liberia declared independence, making it Africa's first republic at a time when European powers were busy carving up the continent. With American backing, though, Liberia largely escaped the pressures of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, placing it in a position almost like a de facto American protectorate. When the rest of the continent was under European flags, Liberia and Ethiopia stood alone as independent states. Proof that colonization wasn't inevitable. But independence came with contradictions. The Americo-Liberian elite, descendants of those freed slaves, dominated politics and land ownership, often sidelining the indigenous majority. Corruption was rampant, with the 1927 election being the most rigged in world history, with the winning candidate receiving 15 times the number of eligible voters. Even so, Liberia, along with Ethiopia, became a symbol of African self-rule and a haven for those seeking freedom. Afghanistan became infamous as the graveyard of empires for a reason. In the 19th century, the British Empire tried again and again to bring it under control, fearing Russia's advance from the north. 3 wars followed, each ending in disaster for the invaders. The First Anglo-Afghan War saw an entire British garrison wiped out as it tried to retreat from Kabul. Only a single survivor reached safety. The Second War ended with heavy British casualties and a withdrawal after propping up a client ruler. The Third War came after World War I, when Afghanistan under Amanullah Khan pushed for full independence and got it. Now you might be thinking, wait, weren't the Afghans already independent? And well, yes, technically they were, but after the Second War with the British ended up controlling Afghanistan's foreign policy, but Afghanistan remained independent. Though Afghanistan lost territory and endured constant interference, it never became a colony. Its mountains, tribal network, and ferocious resistance made it virtually unconquerable, as the Soviets and Americans would later figure out. By the 20th century, Afghans wore their survival as a badge of pride. They had outlasted one empire after another. For centuries, Siam, today's Thailand, sat between 2 giants, British Burma to the west and French Indochina to the east. Most kingdoms in that position ended up carved in half, but Siam's rulers, especially King Mongkut or Rama IV and his son Chula Longkorn Rama V, played the colonial game with rare skill. They modernized the army, reformed government, and sent envoys to Europe, all while carefully granting small territorial concessions to Britain and France. By giving up the edges, they kept their heartland. The result was pretty remarkable. Siam became Southeast Asia's only kingdom never fully colonized by Europe. Thailand was also left as a buffer between the British in Burma and the French in Indochina, which was codified in an 1896 Anglo-French treaty. Thailand's independence wasn't just luck, it was strategy. Diplomacy backed by just enough modernization to make colonization look like too much trouble. When US warships steamed into Tokyo Bay in 1853, Japan faced a stark choice: remain closed off and risk being carved up like other parts of Asia, or adapt to a new global order. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships shattered the old Tokugawa shogunate, and out of the chaos came the Meiji Restoration, one of the most rapid transformations in history. Japan industrialized at breakneck speed. Railroads cut across the islands, Western-style schools and universities trained a new generation, and a modern army and navy were built almost from scratch. By the 1890s, Japan wasn't just catching up, it was challenging the old empires. In 1895, it crushed China in the First Sino-Japanese War, gaining Taiwan and Korea as its sphere of influence. A decade later, in 1905, Japan stunned the world by defeating Russia, the first time an Asian power had beaten a European empire in a modern war. In less than half a century, Japan had gone from a feudal backwater to a global power. Not only did Japan avoid colonization, it flipped the script entirely, becoming one of the 20th century's most aggressive imperial powers. For centuries, Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom because of its isolationist foreign policy, restricted trade, limited contact with the West, and a cautious distance for missionary activity. And nowadays, North Korea is still low-key doing the same, and it's still called that as well. But anyways, moving on. European ships showed up to Korea in the 1800s demanding trade, and Korea's answer was basically no thanks and don't come back. The French tried in 1866, and the Americans tried in 1871, and both times they got sent home empty-handed. But isolation came at a price. When Japan modernized and started looking for its own empire, Korea was first on the list. By 1910, it was annexed by Japan, not Europe, and endured 35 years of brutal colonial rule. So technically, Korea dodged European colonization, only to be conquered by a new Asian power that had learned all the same tricks. Korea never fell to Europe, but Europe's playbook still caught up with it. Europe never managed to colonize China, but it certainly tried to. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain's insatiable thirst for tea created a trade imbalance with the Chinese that they couldn't sustain. The solution? Introducing opium to China. By flooding Chinese ports with the drug to better their trade balance, Britain sparked a crisis that the Qing dynasty tried to resist. The result was the Opium Wars, where British gunboats shattered Chinese defences, forced humiliating treaties that ceded Hong Kong, opened treaty ports, and left the empire's sovereignty in tatters. Portugal had already taken Macau centuries earlier, turning China's southern coast into a showcase of foreign enclaves. This humiliation deepened in 1899 with the Boxer Rebellion. This desperate uprising sought to purge the foreign presence, Western powers, missionaries, and their local allies. Instead, it ended in catastrophe. An 8-nation alliance invaded, stormed Beijing, and even looted the Forbidden City. China remained sovereign on paper, but in reality it was carved up into spheres of influence, a semi-colonized giant that could be pushed around but never entirely subdued. Yet China endured. Decades of warlords, civil wars, and foreign bullying, particularly from Japan, eventually gave way to a centralized government. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party seized power in 1949, determined to end what they called the Century of Humiliation. Under Mao, China closed itself to foreign control, charting a fiercely independent course, one that sometimes turned inward and brutal, but one that ensured China was never again at the mercy of European empires. By the end of the 20th century, both Hong Kong and Macau were handed back, sealing the reversal of what colonialism had taken. Despite being fractured, invaded, and nearly dismantled, China had stitched itself back together. Europe may have forced its way in, but it never stayed. The British tried their luck to take over Nepal in the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1815, and found out the hard way that mountain warfare wasn't their strong suit. Nepal lost some territory, but the British were so impressed by their fighters that they started hiring them instead. That's how the Gurkhas became legends, serving in the British Army while their homeland stayed independent. Well, sort of independent. Like Afghanistan, following this war with the British, the Nepalese were left to their own devices, sort of kept as this buffer state between China and British India, and weren't considered to be more than a British vassal landlocked in the Himalayas. Nepal was never directly colonized though, and by 1923, Britain and Nepal signed a treaty of friendship, and Nepalese sovereignty was respected, until Gen Z threatened it in 2025. Slay motherfucker. Like Afghanistan, Persia, or modern-day Iran, was caught between two giants. When Britain and Russia began carving up the Middle East in the 19th century, they both wanted a piece of Persia, but neither dared to take all of it. Instead, they turned it into a sphere of influence tug-of-war. Britain dominated the south and the oil fields, Russia the north, while the Shah struggled to keep the middle intact. Persia signed away concessions, lost autonomy, but never flew a European or Western flag. Even when Britain and Russia occupied parts of Iran during both world wars, the country itself was never formally colonized. But independence didn't mean immunity. In the 1950s, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, democratically elected and determined to nationalize Iran's oil, was toppled in a coup orchestrated by Britain and the United States. Foreign interference propped up the Shah, but it planted the seeds of fury. By 1979, that fury erupted into the Islamic Revolution, a complete rejection of Western dominance and a radical reassertion of Iranian independence. Iran survived through nationalism, diplomacy, and sheer stubbornness. Once upon a time, Mongolia was the empire, stretching from Europe to the Pacific under Genghis Khan's heirs. But by the 20th century, the conquerors had become the vulnerable ones. Caught between two giants, the Soviet Union and China, Mongolia seemed destined to be swallowed whole. Instead, it pulled off a balancing act. The Soviets poured in aid, tanks, and friendly advice. They imposed communism, switched the script to Cyrillic, and used Mongolia as a buffer state against China. But crucially, they never absorbed it into the USSR. Mongolia remained a separate state, marching to Moscow's rhythm but still technically independent. Even earlier than this, when the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, Mongolia seized the chance to declare independence. It wobbled through Chinese attempts at reasserting control, Japanese ambitions in the region, and endless power struggles. But unlike Tibet, it had the Soviet Union as a shield, and that shield kept it intact. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Mongolia shrugged off communism and embraced democracy, holding elections and opening to the world. Throughout all of it though, no Western flag ever flew over Ulaanbaatar. So yes, Russia did rewrite its alphabet and shaped its politics, but Mongolia was never colonized. While Britain was busy swallowing up India, Bhutan quietly stayed out of reach, mostly thanks to its fortress-like mountains and clever diplomacy. The British made a few border incursions in 1865 and took some land, but they quickly realised that conquering a kingdom with no roads and towering passes wasn't worth the trouble. Bhutan lost this brief skirmish, but sovereignty remained intact. A 1910 treaty between the two countries also made sure that Britain respected Bhutan's autonomy and would protect Bhutan against other powers. This was mostly against the threat of China invading, and yes, this China that was falling apart by this point. Bhutan's isolation in the eastern Himalayas made invasion a logistical nightmare, and the kingdom's steep cliffs and dense forests were enough to discourage any further colonial ambitions from Britain. So while the rest of South Asia was carved up and coloured pink on the colonial map, Bhutan stayed proudly grey. Small, hidden and unbowed, a mountain fortress kingdom that refused to kneel. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was the nightmare Europe couldn't get rid of. From Vienna to the Middle East, it wasn't being colonized, it was doing the colonizing. Well, more like conquering, occupying and converting, but yeah, you get my point. Even as the empire declined in the 19th century, Western powers circled like vultures but never quite got the prize. They invaded parts, took debts and tried to slice it up after World War I, but the Turkish heartland fought back. After World War I, Britain, France, Italy and Greece all tried to divide Anatolia under the Treaty of Sèvres. But Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led the Turkish War of Independence, defeating the invaders and forcing the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognized a sovereign Republic of Turkey in 1923. Geography played a key part. Anatolia was defensible, with mountains and coasts difficult for occupiers to hold, but it was the leadership of Ataturk, modernizing the army, rallying support and uniting diverse groups that turned defeat into survival. Turkey's independence carried contradictions. The Ottoman collapse had costed vast territories, and the new republic relied on harsh centralization and sweeping reforms to secure its place, like abolishing the caliphate. Yet when much of the Middle East became colonial mandates, Turkey stood apart, not petitioned, not occupied long-term, and determined to chart its own path. Saudi Arabia's story is unlike most of the Middle East. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain and France carved up vast empires across the region, but the heart of the Arabian Peninsula was never fully colonized. Instead, Arabia was unified through the rise of Ibn Saud, who in the early 20th century forged alliances, waged tribal wars, and ultimately proclaimed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. The Ottoman Empire's decline and eventual withdrawal from the region in the 19th and early 20th centuries left a power vacuum that allowed local Arab leaders to consolidate control for the first time in centuries. The British, meanwhile, having already secured the coastal regions and with no oil yet discovered, saw little reason to dig in deeper. Ibn Saud used this to his advantage. While Britain maintained influence through treaties with Gulf sheikdoms and arms deals, the heart of Arabia remained sovereign under his rule. Despite a 1915 treaty that briefly tied Ibn Saud to British interests, the kingdom's endurance was rooted less in foreign backing and more in the land itself. A vast, unforgiving desert that resisted conquest, and a people whose will to remain free proved just as unyielding. While much of the Middle East was carved into colonial mandates, the Arabian heartland stood apart. Its harsh geography and the absence of discovered oil made it both difficult and not worth the effort to try occupy.